Hello, and welcome to a very brief discussion on skull classifications. Of course, this content is covered in your textbook, but you may see questions about skull classifications on the final exam, so I wanted to talk about just a few of the key points. And let's begin our discussion with skull morphology. Now, even though most of our head work is done in CT or MRI, if you happen to be employed in a rural area that doesn't have access to 24-hour CT or MRI, maybe those are mobile modalities that come to your facility, understanding how to image the skull is really important because different skull types require different positioning. The shape of an average skull is described as mesocephalic, and we base all of our learning and all of our positioning on the mesocephalic skull. But as you'll see, variations in the width or the length of the skull can equate to variations in our positioning. And we'll explain more of that in a minute. So the average adult skull measures 15 centimeters wide, and that is from parietal eminence to parietal eminence, and 19 centimeters from the frontal eminence to the inion, or the base of the skull. The average adult skull measures 23 centimeters from the vertex to beneath the chin. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this average rule, which we'll talk about. A general rule for describing skull type is to compare the width of the skull at the parietal eminences with the length measured from, again, the frontal eminence to the inion. So describing the average skull is helpful by describing the width compared to the length. For the average mesocephalic skull, the width is 75 to 80% of the length. So the width is always less than the length, approximately 75 to 80%. However, variations, of course, exist. So, a couple terms I want you to know. Brachycephalic and dolichocephalic. Those describe variations in skull measurements. So, a short, wide head or broad head is described as brachycephalic. A long, narrow head is described as dolichocephalic. So in a brachycephalic skull, the width is 80% or greater of the length. So remember, average is the width is 75 to 80% of the length. In a brachycephalic, the width is more than 80% of the length. Okay, so the width is closer to being equal to the measurement of the length in a brachycephalic skull. In a dolichocephalic skull, the width is less than 75% of the total length, so it's more narrow. A second variation is the angle difference between the petrous pyramids and mid-sagittal plane. So in the average-shaped mesocephalic skull, the petrous pyramids form an angle of about 47 degrees from mid-sagittal plane, and that's what you see here. However, in the brachycephalic skull, because the skull is wider, the petrous pyramid angle is greater than 47 degrees. It's actually closer to 54 degrees. In the dolichocephalic skull, the angle is less than 47 degrees, closer to 40. So all of the positioning that we've learned in lab, we're assuming a mesocephalic skull. We're assuming the average skull type. But it's important to understand the different skull types so that you can make adjustments in your positioning if necessary. And certainly, if you position for a skull and things are a little bit off, things aren't perfect like you thought they would be, the different skull morphologies or classifications could be the explanation. And if you look in your textbook, there are suggestions for how to modify positioning based on skull classifications. So you would just get out your Bontrager and make any adjustments as necessary. Okay, so that concludes our discussion on skull classifications. If you have any questions or would like further explanation, please let me know.